The Arizona Territory in the summer of 1878 was a land where the sky stretched so wide it made men feel both free and insignificant, and the earth beneath baked under a relentless sun. Thomas Mercer wiped the sweat from his brow as he stood outside his small ranch house, his eyes scanning the horizon where heat waves danced and shimmered like spirits. At 45 years old, Thomas had watched his dreams crumble slowly over 15 years, drought stealing his water, disease claiming his cattle, and loneliness eating at his soul. His wife Margaret had died 4 winters past, taken by a fever that swept through the territory, and his 2 grown sons had headed to California seeking fortunes their father's land couldn't provide. Now Thomas stood alone with 12 cattle, 1 horse, and a stubbornness that refused to let him abandon the promise he'd made to Margaret on her deathbed. He'd sworn to make something of this land, to honor her belief in him, even when that belief felt like a weight too heavy to carry. The nearest town, Dusty Creek, sat 15 miles east, and the folks there whispered that Thomas Mercer was a fool clinging to dead dreams. Maybe they were right, Thomas thought as he looked at his weathered hands, but a man without his word was a man without anything at all. His horse Bella, a chestnut mare with a white star on her forehead, nickered softly from the corral, and Thomas walked over to stroke her neck. Bella was his last valuable possession, worth enough to buy passage anywhere, but selling her felt like selling the last piece of hope he had left. The morning sun climbed higher, and Thomas squinted against the brightness as movement on the distant plain caught his attention. 2 small figures moved slowly across the open ground, their progress unsteady and labored in a way that suggested trouble. Thomas retrieved his rifle from inside the doorway, a necessary precaution in territory where survival meant staying alert and prepared for anything. As the figures drew closer, Thomas's grip on the rifle loosened when he realized they were young girls, teenagers by the look of them, dressed in traditional Apache clothing. The taller girl, maybe 16, supported her younger sister who limped badly, each step seeming to cause her tremendous pain. Every instinct born from years of territorial conflict told Thomas to send them away, to protect himself from any involvement with the Apache people. Settlers and Apache had spilled each other's blood for years, and helping these girls could bring trouble he couldn't afford. But then Thomas heard Margaret's voice in his mind, gentle but firm, reminding him that compassion wasn't something you rationed based on convenience. She'd always said that the measure of a person revealed itself in moments when helping cost something real. Thomas set his rifle against the porch railing and walked toward the girls with his hands open and visible at his sides. The older girl immediately stepped in front of her sister, her dark eyes fierce with protective determination despite her obvious exhaustion. Thomas stopped a safe distance away, close enough to see the younger girl's ankle swollen grotesquely, likely broken or severely sprained. He pointed to the ankle, then to his house, miming the act of helping, hoping they'd understand his intentions. The older girl shook her head vigorously, speaking rapid Apache words while gesturing that they needed nothing from him. Pride, Thomas recognized it immediately, the same stubborn pride that kept him on this failing ranch when wisdom said to leave. He nodded respectfully, then walked to his well and drew up fresh water, carrying the bucket back and setting it between them. The girls stared at the water, and Thomas saw the younger one's tongue dart across cracked lips before she whispered to her sister. After a tense moment, the older girl's resistance crumbled, and she helped her sister forward to drink. They drank desperately, water spilling down their chins, and Thomas felt his heart clench at their obvious suffering. When they finished, he pointed again to the injured ankle and his house, his expression conveying that he only wanted to help. The older girl looked at her sister's swollen foot, then at the vast distance still ahead, and practicality finally won over pride. She nodded once, quickly, and together they helped the younger girl to Thomas's porch. Thomas went inside and returned with clean bandages, a tin of healing salve Margaret had taught him to make, and fresh water for cleaning. He knelt before the younger girl, working slowly so the older sister could see exactly what he was doing with each movement. The ankle was badly sprained, maybe fractured, and Thomas wrapped it carefully with the skill of a man who doctored his own injuries for years. As he worked, the younger girl spoke softly to her sister in their language, and though Thomas couldn't understand, he heard gratitude in her tone. When he finished, Thomas stood and made a decision that would change everything. He walked to the corral where Bella waited, and he led her out, saddling her with practiced movements while the sisters watched in confusion. The older girl's eyes widened with sudden understanding, and she shook her head emphatically, speaking rapidly while pointing at Thomas's meager ranch. She understood what this horse meant to him, that giving it away would leave him with nothing but cattle he couldn't drive alone. Thomas smiled sadly and pointed to her sister's wrapped ankle, then to the distant mountains where he knew their people must be. On foot with that injury, they'd never make it, but on horseback, they could reach safety by nightfall. The older girl continued refusing, her sense of honor preventing her from accepting what she knew was his last valuable possession. Thomas gently took her hand and pressed the reins into it, closing her fingers around the leather with finality. He stepped back and nodded, his message clear. This was his choice, and he was at peace with it. The older girl stared at him, her dark eyes filling with tears. She quickly blinked away, and she spoke words heavy with meaning. Thomas couldn't understand her language, but he felt the weight of a promise in her tone, an oath being sworn. He helped the younger girl mount Bella, positioning her carefully so her injured ankle wouldn't bear weight during the ride. The younger sister reached down and squeezed Thomas's hand, her small fingers conveying gratitude that transcended any language barrier. Then the older girl led Bella away, walking beside her mounted sister as they headed toward the distant mountains. Thomas watched until they disappeared into the shimmering heat, then turned back to his empty corral and his handful of cattle. He'd just given away his last real chance at survival, and yet somehow he felt lighter than he had in years. That night, Thomas sat on his porch as stars filled the sky, wondering if he'd been noble or foolish, suspecting he'd been both. He fell asleep in his chair, exhaustion claiming him before he could move inside. The thunder of hooves woke him in the gray light before dawn, a sound so immense it seemed to shake the earth itself. Thomas's eyes flew open, and his blood turned to ice at the sight that greeted him. Warriors on horseback filled his land, at least 200 of them, their faces painted and their weapons gleaming in the early light. At their head sat a man whose bearing and presence marked him unmistakably as a chief, authority radiating from him like heat from the sun. Thomas rose slowly, his legs weak with fear, certain he was witnessing the arrival of his death. His rifle sat inside the doorway, but reaching for it seemed pointless against such overwhelming numbers. Then Thomas saw them, the two sisters, riding together on Bella directly behind the chief, their hair braided and their clothing clean. The chief raised his hand, and the massive group of warriors fell instantly silent, disciplined, and watchful. He dismounted with fluid grace and walked toward Thomas's porch, each step measured and deliberate. Thomas stood his ground, not from bravery but because his fear had rooted him in place like an old tree. The chief stopped at the porch steps, and Thomas could see intelligence and something like respect in the man's weathered face. The older sister dismounted and hurried to stand beside her father, ready to translate between two worlds. The chief spoke in Apache, his voice deep and commanding, and his daughter translated carefully. She said her father wanted to know why Thomas had helped his daughters when he could have harmed them or turned them away. Thomas found his voice, explaining that he saw two young people in trouble who needed help, nothing more complicated than that. The girl translated, and the chief responded with more questions about the water, the medicine, the horse. Thomas answered honestly, saying his late wife had taught him that a man's character showed itself when helping cost him something real. The chief listened to the translation, his expression shifting to something that looked almost like recognition. He spoke again, and his daughter's voice carried emotion as she translated. She explained that her father said Thomas had given his last horse, his survival, to save two Apache girls when most white men would have given only violence. The chief climbed the porch steps and placed his hand firmly on Thomas's shoulder, speaking directly to him. His daughter translated that such honor could not go unanswered, that the Apache people remembered those who showed them humanity. The chief called out commands, and warriors immediately began unloading pack horses, carrying goods to Thomas's porch. Blankets, dried meat, tools, and supplies piled up as Thomas watched in stunned disbelief. Other warriors rode toward his cattle, and Thomas's heart seized, thinking they were taking his last livestock. Instead, they herded in more cattle, adding to his herd until it numbered over 60 head. Still more warriors dismounted and began repairing his fences, his barn, his well, working with quiet efficiency. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face, the first he'd shed since Margaret's funeral. The younger sister approached and hugged him tightly, whispering words he couldn't understand but felt in his heart. The older girl explained that her father was repaying the debt of honor, that saving his daughters meant saving his world. She said refusing the gifts would dishonor both her father and Thomas's own generous act. Throughout the morning, the work continued as the sun rose higher, transforming Thomas's failing ranch into something prosperous. The chief stood beside Thomas, and through his daughter, they shared stories of loss, struggle, and the weight of keeping promises. Thomas learned the girls had been separated from their group and traveled 2 days before reaching his ranch, near death from thirst and exhaustion. When the work finished, the chief clasped Thomas's hand and spoke final words his daughter translated with pride. She said her father declared Thomas a friend to the Apache people, that his honor would be remembered in their stories for generations. Tied to Bella's saddle, Thomas found a chief's knife in a beaded sheath, symbols carved into the handle telling the story of that day. The warriors mounted their horses and rode away as silently as they'd come, disappearing into the landscape like a fading dream. Thomas stood surrounded by abundance he hadn't possessed hours before, his ranch restored and his future suddenly bright with possibility. He lifted the chief's knife, understanding that true wealth was measured not in possessions, but in the character shown when those possessions were all you had. Margaret had known this truth, and she'd planted it deep in Thomas's heart where it waited for the right moment to bloom. In the years that followed, Thomas's ranch prospered, and he became known throughout the territory as a man of uncommon integrity. He passed the chief's knife to his sons when they returned from California, telling them the story that changed their father's life. And Thomas never forgot the lesson learned at dawn when 200 warriors taught him that kindness, freely given, returns in ways beyond imagination. The last horse he gave away became the first blessing of many, proof that honor recognized honor across any divide. Retry.